I'm going to try and make a video that hopefully can be educational, but it isn't going to be one of those ones with a ton of pictures and video clips. Just wondering how different ones might respond to just the idea of learning some different stuff. It isn't going to be quite like, going to school and hearing a bunch of stuff where you're like, what the freaking hell? See, I've been doing some research because of the fact that there's always some kind of debate, really, about whether or not there's a God, right? And there's different ones who believe in the Big Bang Theory. They believe that, life just basically appeared out of nowhere. One day, boom, there was an explosion and there was life. And then they mock those who believe in God, which I always thought was interesting. Because if you talk to scientists who actually talk about the Big Bang Theory, if you were to ask them, so how exactly did it occur? And most of the time they're like, well, we don't really know. We just have theories, we have hypotheses, but none of them can really explain it to where it makes sense, especially if you think about the fact that if you look at every kind of explosion there's ever been, there was never life created from an actual detonation. And yet, they believe that life happened from some kind of detonation. The atomic bomb didn't create life, it destroyed it. The hydrogen bomb didn't create life, it destroyed it. Every time they've had some kind of detonation of a sort, it always destroyed life instead of creating it. So, in essence, what kind of faith does a scientist have to believe that just from mere chance, some particles collided together and created life? Would you say that's similar to religion, talking about a miracle? Now, if they want to make fun of religion, I'm just trying to explain why do you think that saying that you don't really know how life existed is any less of a motion of faith almost? You know, like an idea of faith, a belief system that you have to just believe. And when someone like, well, the Bible says the Earth was created in 6 days, and yet there's tons of fossil records. Yeah, but what's interesting is if you look at it from a certain perspective, realizing that there's a scripture that says that 1,000 years are but a day to God, right? And then realizing where that was in history according to the Bible of how many years man was on earth. So what was 1,000 years like to them? Then if you think in terms of God instead of in terms of man. See, that's something that I noticed in reading the Bible, was that a lot of the different stuff that's written there is written from a certain kind of perspective, which is part of the reason why it wouldn't surprise me that God used men to write the Bible, but that because men wrote the Bible, they couldn't comprehend certain ideas, or because of the way stuff was written, that unless you thought the way God thinks, some of it might not make sense. But if you consider that God is the source of dynamic energy, now thinking of E equals mc squared, right? If you think about the idea that E equals mc squared was part of how they created the atomic bomb, right? Realizing that all mass is energy, right? Energy, E, equals mass, M, times the speed of light, which the C actually is constant, is what it stands for. The constant of the speed of light, because the speed of light travels at a certain velocity. Now, does that mean that all light travels at the exact same speed? The answer is no, it doesn't. Because it's affected from gravitational forces of various planets, black holes. What's interesting is when you realize, what is a black hole? A black hole, in essence, is a star that died, that has created an immense gravitational pull. Now, that's something that I thought was interesting, because when it says that light doesn't escape from that gravitational pull, then that means it's changed the speed of light. But does that mean that light doesn't exist? And if you think about a dying star, think about it in terms of what if there was like something the size of the moon, possibly Pluto, that have a gravitational pull similar to Jupiter. You know what I mean? So if you can comprehend that idea, because Jupiter is I think the largest planet in our solar system, and the gravitational pull is immense. Now, if you think about that kind of gravity from an object in space, that the molecular structure is so dense because it was a star. And the star, when it was functioning the way it was supposed to, was a self generating energy source. Now, that's something that's interesting because when you think about all that energy, right, and then what happened to it? Not being compressed. See, that's part of what gave me the idea about energy and God. Because if God is energy, the source of dynamic energy, and if all mass is energy, E equals mc squared, that basically the idea that what if God was an intelligent energy source, just almost pure energy, yet intelligent? And what if it was somewhere all that energy was directed someplace to actually compress and create matter, which is part of the reason why, when I was looking at various theories, string theory, when they talk about string theory, I mean, it's changed somewhat, but if you watch some different, programs about string theory, it's talking about how, in essence, it's just saying that all mass is energy. Little strings of energy that, tie all matter together. So, if that's the case, and if God is the source of dynamic energy, if He compressed the energy, does it make sense that just like someone would make blueprints for a house and then build a house, that God had an idea of creating the universe, compressed the energy, and created the earth and all life? Now, some look at the fossil record and they're like, well, there's life and then there's death, and then there's life and then there's death, because there's different layers of fossil record. And I was thinking about what is it that, farmers use to cultivate a field? A lot of times they use tractors, right? What do they use when they're going to pave a road? Dump trucks, bulldozers, different kinds of machinery, even to build a building. Skyscrapers use cranes. What if dinosaurs were God's machines to get Earth ready for the life He intended? And that instead of God creating like a tractor, a bulldozer, so because when you look at some of those fossils, there's different stuff that some different scientists are like, we can't explain what some of the functions of some, and I'm like, but what if it's more simple than what you believe? Because if you look at them as if they were just machines created from God to prepare the earth for the life He intended. Which is why at certain points He would just, and the next set of machinery would be put in place. So even though they were alive, they were dinosaurs that were alive, they had a certain function, including certain dinosaurs that might eat each other or eat plants, because what would that do for the soil? And then when you look at the actual record of, the creation of life, according to the Bible, something I always thought was interesting is it's an order that sustains life. If it had been different, If they changed some of the order of what was written there, it wouldn't have made sense and it wouldn't have sustained life. But if you look at the actual order of events, it's the order that's necessary to sustain life. And it was something else that I thought was interesting. It's how the Bible talked about how the earth hangs on nothing, talked about the circle of the earth. It said that God stretches the heavens out as a tent. And recently, scientists have said that they found someplace where it appears as if the universe is actually spreading from, which I'm going, well, maybe that's what it's talking about. Maybe that is the point of creation, and it isn't where the Big Bang happened. Maybe it's like what the Bible said, that God created the universe, and then it's spreading from his central creation point. Which is part of why when I looked at the pyramids, and if you look at a dollar bill, there's a pyramid with an all-seeing eye. When I looked at that, and I found out that the pyramids in Egypt actually have a relationship with certain constellations, and then looking at the shape of the pyramids, that if you put, 5 more pyramids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to create a cube. In the middle of that cube, the top of the pyramid, is within what is thought of as a 3-dimensional space. What if the pyramids, in essence, were star charts? What if the all-seeing eye is a representation of God? What if there's more to the pyramids than just what different ones have thought of for years as a mystery that couldn't be solved, but instead it's actually something that isn't that much of a mystery if you think and reason? So as I started, thinking about a lot of that different kinds of stuff, it was something where I started to wonder, how possibly could I prove the existence of God? A lot of creationists, the way they talk about it, it's almost like, well, you have to have faith. You just have to believe. And they don't always use science to prove the Bible is true or that God created. A lot of times creationists want to just think of it as it's a miracle, which in essence to me is as stupid as a scientist saying, well, you just got to believe that a Big Bang created it all. Like either way you look at it, you're both saying you have to have faith. You have to have faith that a big explosion created all life, and you're saying you have to have faith because you don't think there's actual proof almost, because you think it's a miracle. Well, a miracle is something that can't be explained necessarily, right? Doesn't make it less of a miracle if you actually figure out how it was done. Especially if you realize some of the forces that are necessary to create some of those miracles. So thinking about in terms of energy, that was something that as I looked at different religions, and wanted to learn about different cultures, when I found out about Qi, right? Qi flow they talk about. Martial arts and a lot of Eastern religions talk about Qi flow. And believe it or not, the idea of it doesn't detract from the Bible if you realize how could Jesus have turned water into wine? How could Jesus and his apostles have resurrected different ones? What if it was based on energy flows? And how is that possible? How could just energy flows from a body actually do some of that? And then, this is what's interesting. If you think about what do they do when someone has a heart attack? Right? And you realize, what is it? What are they doing with an electric shock? To get the heart started. What if you could actually put electric impulses through your hands with some kind of energy. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm just going to, like it's some kind of something like, the Emperor in Star Wars, Emperor Palpatine, and stuff. And yet, the idea is somewhat similar. What if Jesus, in essence, turning the water into wine, almost like a cyclotron, creating wine from water, just changing a few protons, neutrons, electrons, the atomic structure of water, changing it into wine because of energy forces? Scientifically, is it possible? Well, they have cyclotrons that actually do stuff like that, changing, matter from one type to another, changing one type of atomic particle to another. So is it really that far-fetched of an idea to think that God, there's a God that has energy that could create the universe, realizing how much energy would be expended into the universe as we know it today? How much energy is that? So are you going to tell me that if he could create all of that, that it would be more than God could deal with to actually somehow allow humans, including his son on earth when Jesus was born as a human, to have certain abilities using an energy flow similar to the idea of chi? Now, does that mean that it's some kind of pagan something? No, if it's from God, which is why sometimes talking about different stuff, I've noticed different ones get a certain idea. Oh, he's talking about chi. Well, that isn't Christianity. You have to realize I'm a Christian for a number of reasons, which are my personal reasons. And I ain't trying to tell everyone what they have to believe. You can believe what you want to believe. I'm just trying to explain some of it as to just the idea of God and why it is that even as a Christian that I can actually look at other religions and other ideas to actually try to explain the idea that there is a God. Whether you believe in Christianity or any other religion, wouldn't it be nice to actually have a reason to have real faith in your God? Whoever your God is? Instead of just, well, you gotta have faith, or some story that sometimes doesn't even make sense. I mean, what do you do if you go out into space and stuff isn't what it says about certain gods? But does that take away from the idea of those gods necessarily, especially if you can comprehend certain other ideas? And why is it so many religions have similar stories? What does that say about religion in general? The idea of a flood being talked about in so many different religions, the idea of prophets in so many religions, and all sorts of different stuff, including certain abilities, that are similar to the abilities talked about in the Bible. And yet, sometimes I feel like some of the different stories that are told, it isn't like something to make fun of any religion in particular. However, if you realize that a lot of stuff that was even talked about with the Bible, after a certain point, different ones were saying stuff completely different than what the Bible said. What if it was kind of like one of those telephone line games? You tell somebody something, then they tell someone else, and they tell, the idea of gossip. And what happens with gossip? Doesn't it change? So does that mean that the original ideas with some of those religions were actually something that, whatever it is you want to say about it, that, where some of the ideas that now have been proven to be impossible, right? So it isn't like trying to point out a religion to make fun of it, but it's something where just the idea of scientifically looking at some of it for what it is, if it's proven it wasn't true, Does that necessarily mean you can't have faith in God? Is it something where you just, where you should feel ashamed of your faith, whatever it is, because some of the ideas don't seem to exist once man went to space or did other kinds of research? So if you have at least a basis to believe there's a God, might that help you to feel better about whatever religion you have, knowing that you have a real reason to believe there's a God? And then maybe looking at whatever religion it is and trying to find the truth of that religion instead of the stories of the religion. You know what I mean? See, I've done research even about Christianity, and I realize most Christian religions anymore, they aren't really Christian religions. They actually contradict a lot of what the Bible says. Does that make me less of a Christian, or is it something where I actually did some research and found out certain realities? So when you start realizing some of that for what it is, you know what I mean? And so I felt like, what if different ones could put into perspective the idea that if God exists, certain other ideas don't seem as far-fetched, and that you can have an actual scientific reason to believe in God. And for me, that makes it to where I have faith that is actually grounded in reality. It's somewhere my faith actually has a good foundation to actually believe in a God instead of just, well, you just gotta believe, you just gotta have faith. So, looking at it in certain kinds of terms, simplistic terms, if you want to think about it, what if someone told you that they were going to build you a house and they had all of the necessary components and equipment and materials to build a house? And they said, you can either build it according to the theory of evolution, the Big Bang Theory, or you could build it in accordance with the idea of God and creative design. Now, what's interesting about that is if you were going to have your house built based on one of those two ideas, how do you think you would want your house built? That an explosion miraculously created something that wasn't there? Or the idea that there was a design involved and it was all placed according to the design? How do you want your house built? Do you believe in evolution or do you believe in creation? And see, that's the type of questions that when you really start to think about it, if somebody's like, well, that isn't fair. Why? Why would you say that? Why would you say that isn't a fair question? Why? Don't you believe in evolution? If you believe in evolution, then you should feel, like your house can be built exactly the way the universe was created, with a big explosion. Right? And if suddenly you're like, so you like the idea of creative design. You want a floor plan. You want someone to actually build it so that there's a house that you can guarantee will actually exist. So, is it such a far-fetched idea to think of God as a creator, as a designer, as the master carpenter almost? Except for instead of creating houses and wagons, created the universe. Maybe that's part of the reason why Jesus was born to a carpenter, a construction worker of sorts. You ever think about that? So it's somewhere, as I've done my research and looking at what's happened with science at different times, I started having certain ideas, realizing that it it's contrary in some respects to what science says, but it also agrees with science because I'm using scientific fact. And that's why I find it interesting, like I said, that there were those who would want to mock someone like me because I'm a Christian and I believe in God. And, you believe in fairy tales? No. A fairy tale is a story that isn't true and that has some kind of, fantasy. Do you feel that way about the evolution theory? Well, blah, 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 science, 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 whatever, and stuff. And then it's like, yeah, but explain it then. Because there's got to be like tons of proof about what you say, and you must know exactly what it was that happened, right? So, and you could probably recreate it because if you can, if you figured it out, then you obviously can recreate that kind of, creative force from an explosion, like what you're talking about. So, I'd really like you to explain it and prove it. And then instead of science, 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 it's excuse, 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 excuse. We don't really know. We're guessing and blah, blah, blah. And then after a while, it's like, well, wait a minute. Didn't you tell me that I believed in fairy tales because I said I believe in God? But you're telling me that you really have no real definitive idea of your miracle of creation that was evolution that started from particles colliding, creating an explosion that miraculously created life, and you don't think that sounds almost like a religion without any reason to believe other than you just gotta have faith? You expect me to just have faith then? You expect me to believe in the religion of evolution and to just have faith and just believe because you told me to believe it. And yet, if I tell you that I believe that God created the universe with creative design, compressing energy together to create life, and that's the reason why humans have what is considered bioenergy, right? Biological. It's just what? Like electrical impulses, right? Electrical impulses, neurons, receptors, and all that kind of stuff, nervous system, all that allows for life to exist, which is energy flow. So if all that energy is, flowing through a human body, you think that it's a far-fetched idea to believe that God is pure energy and then compress that energy to create life, and that we're kind of like robots to God when you consider what God is, and then when man creates robots, it's similar to God creating animals and humans. You know what I mean? The difference is God can actually create actual life, and humans have seemed to have found a little bit of difficulty trying to figure out how God did some of that. Oh, except for the Bible explains it. But you want to limit your thinking. In fact, with mathematics that they use, they don't want to use infinity. That's something that, as I was doing research and looking at different books, it's like, how do you use infinity in calculating? You can't. Infinity is something that you really. I think you can use infinity in calculating. It's just beyond the scope of what you can imagine, because you set limitations for yourselves, because the idea of infinity is more than what you can deal with. So instead of actually using infinity as part of your equations, you've removed the idea of infinity and tried to set limits. And those limits have been a detriment. Instead of opening more doors and getting it to where it actually, we could have certain types of energy sources and different stuff that could actually work with the idea of infinity, you wanted to remove the idea of infinity and limit what science could actually do because you didn't want to believe in God. I thought you said science was progressive. If science is progressive, why do you want to limit yourselves? When you think about stars in the solar system, the sun, right? And then there's, other, stars in the Milky Way, and then there's other galaxies within the universe. And when you think about all those stars as self generating energy sources, that unlike a fire on Earth, what happens if you have a fire, right? You get like some wood and paper, put some gasoline on it, maybe to get it to ignite really quick, you got a fire, right? But what happens after all that fuel is gone? Does it continue to burn? Only if you add fuel to the fire, right? I mean, they have those wildfires at different places that burn out of control and all that, right? Except for there's something interesting about it. Even those fires, if there were no firefighters at all, would those fires eventually burn themselves out? And what's the reason they would eventually burn themselves out? Now, there might be a ton of damage, true. But what's the reason why those fires would eventually burn themselves out? Because there'd be a lack of fuel for the fire. And yet, when you realize what's the most amount of time that a fire like that could burn on Earth before it would run out of fuel, and the sun in our solar system has been burning for millennia in the vacuum of space, where there's no oxygen or nitrogen or any kind of flammable gases. How is it possible? If it was just fuel and fire, wouldn't it have burned out millennia ago? What kind of energy is it to create a star? How much energy is necessary? Especially to make sure it's a star that just doesn't burn out real quickly. When you realize the sun has been in existence for millennia and it's still burning bright, how is that possible? And, I was talking to someone about the idea of all that energy and creating a self sustaining energy source that would actually function using what in essence is perpetual motion. It would power itself, creating its own perpetual motion. Now, it creates a generator effect and it powers itself. But there were those who didn't comprehend what I was saying. They're like, well, there's no such thing as perpetual motion. The moon's orbit around the Earth is perpetual motion. You do realize that, right? And then when I was talking about, the idea of a self-generating energy, there's no such thing as self-generating energy source. What do you call the sun and all those other stars that have been burning for millennia? That is self-generating energy. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist anymore. So there's somewhere when you start realizing those ideas, those concepts, and that in order to actually have that exist, you have to include infinity in the equation. Because if you don't, it doesn't make any sense. And when you start realizing that all that energy, even with the stars, the sun, why is it that the sun is the shape of a ball if it's just fire? Have you ever looked at what a match looks like when it's lit in space? And it doesn't look like a flame. It looks like a ball of light. Because there's no gravity. There's certain types of forces that are different. Could that be part of the reason why a star can actually exist? It's kind of interesting, like I said. If you start actually thinking about science, what if you believe in the idea that God actually exists? What if there is scientific proof that you can believe in God, believe in all of that because of the fact that something as simple as the idea from E equals mc squared tells us that all mass is energy, and if God is energy, God could create life. And science can prove it. Now, what's interesting is I've said a lot of different stuff that I could continue, right? I could keep talking. I could, try and explain some of it. But what if you yourself decided to do a bit of research? What if you read your Bible? What if you went and read scientific books? What if you looked at some of the stuff that different ones said and realized some of the reasons why they don't like certain ideas? Because they view it almost as giving up. It's like, wait a minute. So if you start admitting that there's a certain kind of natural order to the universe and stuff like that, whatever, then you feel you're defeated because then you'd have to, admit there's a God. Is that what you're telling me? And so you'd rather limit yourselves with your scientific thinking instead of expanding that scientific thinking to include the idea of God and infinity and all the other stuff that could actually advance science? That doesn't sound like logical thinking. Logical thinking and scientific thinking would have you wanting to advance science, even if it means changing some of your thinking, because that's how science has made advancement throughout the years. All those centuries of scientific research that have changed at different times because of new scientific discoveries. What if believing in God is the next step in scientific discovery?